Online with Terry Jeffrey, a CNS News production.
Welcome to this edition of Online with Terry Jeffrey. Our guest today is Senator Rick Santorum. Santorum was born in Winchester, Virginia, and raised in Butler, Pennsylvania, which is north of Pittsburgh. He earned a bachelor's degree from Penn State University, an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh, and a law degree from the Dickinson School of Law. In 1990, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from the 18th District of Pennsylvania, which is in the western part of the state. In 1990, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he served for 2 terms, being re-elected in 2000. In the Senate, Santorum served on the Agricultural Committee, the Banking Committee, the Finance Committee, and the Rules Committee. From 2001 to 2007, he was chairman of the Republican Senate Conference, the third-ranking leadership position in the Republican Conference in the Senate. As a U.S. Senator, Santorum led the battles for welfare reform, Social Security reform, and to ban partial birth abortion. He is now a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Institute, a political contributor to Fox News, on the board of directors of Universal Health Services, and he and his wife Karen are raising 7 children. Senator Santorum, thanks for coming in.
Very good to be with you again.
Appreciate talking
I'll throw
to you.
one more. I was also on the Armed Services Committee for 8 years.
Oh, there you go.
So
Sorry about
No,
that.
that's okay.
So you, in your time in the Senate, you were looking at the whole range of issues.
Yeah, in fact, when I came to the Senate from the House, I got on the Armed Services Committee principally because I had not had really a military background. And I thought, sort of to round out my experiences, having served on the Ways and Means Committee over in the House, getting either on foreign relations or armed services, and I preferred armed services. I ended up being, because we took the majority, ended up being a subcommittee chairman for 8 years and worked extensively on a lot of procurement issues and research and development and the military. So I was sort of on the procurement side of the military, but it's to me it showed the dramatic technological advances that occur within the military, and obviously the dual-use technology that obviously DARPA, that even though Al Gore says he invented the internet,
right.
it was really the Defense Department
Sure.
invented the internet and all these other dual-use things that investing in defense research has huge economic benefits, not just for the defense industry in this country, but for the broader.
So you were on the Armed Services Committee when 9/11 happened.
I was.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're going to talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about fiscal and economic things first.
Okay.
Last month, President Obama's National Fiscal Commission came back with a report that they called the Moment of Truth. And leaving aside its policy prescriptions, the description they gave of the fiscal situation the country faces was rather dramatic. They said,
Dire, I think, is
dire.
is a good word for it.
And let me give you their exact words. They said, quote, "Our nation is on an unsustainable fiscal path. Spending is rising, the revenues are falling short, requiring the government to borrow huge sums each year to make up the difference. We face staggering deficits. In 2010, federal spending was nearly 24% of gross domestic product, which was only during World War II was federal spending in a larger part of our economy. By 2025, says Obama's Fiscal Commission, revenue will be able to finance only interest payments on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Every other federal government activity, from national defense and homeland security to transportation and energy, will have to be paid for with borrowed money." Now, Senator, let's say, hypothetically, you were president of the United States and you had a large majority of your own party in both houses of Congress. So you basically could write the policy prescriptions going forward for dealing with this fiscal situation. What would be your priorities?
Well, obviously, and this alludes to it, the big problem here is entitlements. The first thing we can do, and I hope this Congress will do this, this is the minimum they should do, and that is to cut back discretionary spending back to the 2008 levels, which means the pre-stimulus level, and stop emergency spending, all these special spending that don't count, but of course they count because we have to borrow money to pay for them. So first and foremost, we hopefully the next 2 years, to get to your question, we'll do something to put the genie back in the bottle on discretionary spending. If that doesn't happen, that would be one of the things I would do first. But the four big areas are the 4 big entitlement programs that exist in Washington, D.C. right now. And I take them in this order. First, Obamacare. Barack Obama was right that healthcare is a huge cost driver for our businesses and for our government, and that we needed to do something about it. And he did. He made it worse. He made it much worse. He increased the amount of money going to a portion of the economy that is increasing faster than any other sector of the economy, with maybe the exception of higher education, which is growing faster. Tuition increases are growing faster than even healthcare increases. There's a commonality between those two. They both have huge government involvement in both of those areas, and they are driving costs up. And so what was Obama's prescription? More government involvement in that area. That's the wrong prescription. I've said it once, I'll say it again. There's nothing salvageable in the Obamacare bill. Not to say that there aren't maybe one or two ideas that are good ideas, but they are intertwined with a system that doesn't work. So we can look at some of those ideas, but they have to be done in the context of returning health care to individuals and to the private sector, not having government control. So that's number one.
So the next president should sign legislation
to repeal Obama.
Repealing Obamacare.
Number one. Number two, again, staying with health care, because those are the big drivers, is Medicaid. Back in 1996, I took to the floor of the United States Senate, and through a quirk, really a quirk, of the fact that the chairman of the Finance Committee back in 1996 had to resign, Bob Packwood. And Bob Packwood, 2 weeks after he resigned, was to bring a bill to reform welfare to the floor of the United States Senate. Well, he resigned, and the new chairman, frankly, didn't know anything about the bill that I actually worked with Bob Packwood on. And the reason I worked with him on it, because when I was in the Ways and Means Committee in the House, I actually drafted the Contract with America welfare reform bill. So I knew a lot about this issue. And so I ended up managing that bill. Now, why do I talk about welfare? Because welfare was the only time in the history of this country where we ended a major federal entitlement. And what we did, we said, look, welfare is a state issue. It's something the states basically manage already. It's just a federal entitlement, and the federal government has a very prescriptive program how the state runs it. But the state runs welfare policy. And so what we said is, look, we need to end the federal entitlement. We need to give a block of money to the states. We need to pare back some of these strings attached to this money and let the states devise their own program. What happened? Welfare rolls decreased by over 50%. Poverty levels went down. People who weren't working and were chronically unemployed went back to work. Family stability increased. All positive benefits. Why do I say that? Because we need to do the exact same thing for Medicaid.
Back then, you actually had a Democratic president.
We had a Democratic president
who was ready to sign the bill.
He did. We had to bribe him. That's the best word for it. We had to put more money in the pot, primarily for daycare. But we did. It was a matter of money, not policy. And for me, I'm willing to trade money for policy if eventually we can get the money. Which, down the road, if you can get the right policy in place, you can save the money. And I think welfare reform proved that. So on Medicaid, we need to do the same thing. We need to repeal the federal entitlement, which is a perverse incentive for the states to spend more money, and turn the program back. I can go down the list. Medicare would be the next thing we'd have to deal with. Social Security after that.
So the state of California is going bankrupt. Right. Their legislative analyst's office in November put out a report that said they face a $20 billion deficit every year for the next 6 years, and that they're going to spend about $20 billion a year on Medi-Cal, which is their state Medicaid program. So their deficit equals their Medi-Cal program. Of their 37 million people under the 2010 census, 7 million of those are on Medi-Cal. So you would say to California, you're on your own?
I would say, here's the money. Here's a block of money. Right now, as you know, the Medicaid funds are split between the federal and state level. And this was, a perverse incentive by very smart progressives in the 1960s figured out that if we cost share with the states, let the states run the program, but we cost share with them, and we pick up a percentage of whatever the cost is, that will incentivize them to grow the program. Right. Why? Because they can get $1 worth of benefit to their constituents for 50 cents on the dollar. And so this perverse incentive to states to grow their program, and the federal government's simply on the hook for it. And California is really, New York is another one, case in point, where they dramatically expanded these programs, and the federal government's picking up 50% of the cost of it.
So Senator, you get rid of the federal entitlement. It all goes back to the states. You're giving them a block grant. Is the block grant frozen at the current
level? That's what we did with welfare. What we said is, look, we'll pretty much leave the money as it is. We didn't cut it because then you get into where do you cut and who do you cut. So we didn't cut it, and we grandfathered everybody in and said, okay, but we're not going to increase it. And so now you have to manage within this amount of money. That would be at least my initial proposal.
Now, of course, as you know, under Obamacare, Medicaid is actually going to expand because they're going to take people up to 125% of the poverty level.
It's
and
going
stick
to
them into
explode,
Medicaid.
not expand. I mean, in states like Pennsylvania, we cover 75% of poverty. In other words, if you're if you're at the poverty level, but only at 75%, in other words, not even everybody who's quote poor gets Medicaid in Pennsylvania. Now they're going to go up to 150% of poverty. So they're going to potentially be even more than double the number of people who are going on. Now, initially they said, well, the federal government will pay for it. But of course, that's unsustainable, and everybody knows it. The state's going to end up having to pick up their portion of it.
All right, so the second thing the next president needs to do after he repeals Obamacare is do Medicaid reform that gives it back to the states, gets rid of the federal entitlement.
Correct.
Let the states deal with it with block grants from the federal government. What's the third problem?
Well, I'd also move one aside on sticking with the states, and that is dealing with this issue of federal employees and state employees, municipal employees. I mean that bill is coming due, and you have huge pension obligations, huge healthcare obligations for retirees in municipal governments and state governments. One of the things I would insist upon, hopefully for this Congress, is no bailouts of the states, no bailouts of these municipalities. And the federal government's going to be facing the same thing. I mean, we're going to be facing the same situation where we've overpromised. There are, I shouldn't say none, there are a few union plans left. There are very few defined benefit plans left in the private sector. Everyone has their 401k. The company says, here's money, you can invest it for your retirement, but they're not sticking the company with an obligation to pay you a certain amount of money in a pension for the future. The federal government needs to move in that direction. That's another reform that we need to do. It's a longer term issue, but it's an important one that we need to do.
Do you think there's any realistic possibility that House of Representatives led by John Boehner would actually approve a bailout of a state?
I certainly hope not. But look, I've seen a lot of bad things happen in Washington, D.C. from people who say they're conservative. So I'm hopeful that the pressure won't come that, California goes bankrupt. You'll hear these. You see this all the time. Well, if California goes bankrupt, it's, X
And they'll say
percent.
part Medicaid, a federal program, is at fault.
Well, they'll say Medicaid's at fault, but look, there's all sorts of reasons that California's going bankrupt. But they will come, and the big argument will be that if California goes bankrupt, the economy will tank. It'll have the ripple effect. You'll see all these. It's TARP all over again, and you've got to bail them out. We can't let. It's too big to fail. Have we heard this before? Well, is there any state that's too big to fail more than California? Of course, and of course, even Republicans from California will say, well, you got to be for this, right? I mean, Republicans are going to be screaming that you can't let our state fail. So there'll be enormous pressure for California because of its huge impact. But then, of course, if you bail out California, well, then why not New York and why not everybody else?
And of course, California was partially bailed out, as some other states were, by stimulus
the stimulus
funds.
package. And that's going to be an area if the the House Republicans are serious about getting this deficit under control. The first thing they should do is pull back as many of those funds as they possibly can.
That haven't
right
already
now.
been spent.
That haven't been
Forget
spent
it.
right now.
Let's stop it. All right, so you say if California's going down, that's Jerry Brown in the legislature in Sacramento, they can deal with it. The federal Congress and taxpayers in Pennsylvania or Ohio, they should not have to pay for the
They have
California
their own
government.
problems. Pennsylvania and Ohio have huge deficits too that they're going to have to deal with. And to bail out California and not Pennsylvania, how is that fair to the people of Pennsylvania? It's not fair, and that's why I'm saying it. You can't bail out one. If you bail out one, then then Katie barred the door. Every state that has a deficit is going to come for money, of which we don't have. So I'm hopeful that even California Republicans will stand up and say this is just simply not the right thing to do, and we have to take tough medicine, and the tough medicine means you're going to have to cut back on your Medicaid programs, you're going to have to cut back on your obligations to your public employees, and those two things, by and large, will solve a big nut of the problem.
Okay, you still have two entitlements.
To go. Okay, Medicare. Medicare is a program that, again, is growing faster than the rate of inflation, and as a result, because of health care, the system is one where you don't have, in my opinion, good cost shares. You have the federal government. You pay taxes throughout the course of your working life, and then the federal government basically provides hospitalization care for the rest of your life. Then we also have this program, Medicare Part B, which is a program that you don't pay for during your life, and the federal government picks up about 75% of the cost of that program. Again, you didn't pay for that. No, most people don't understand that. They think, Medicare, I paid for that. No, you didn't really pay for that. And then you have Medicare Part D, which is the drug benefit. Now, of the three programs, the one that actually works the most efficiently, effectively, and well is the Medicare prescription drug program. Why? Because it's a private sector program that the government simply is the payer. Now, do we have another model for this? Yes, and it's the Federal Employees Health Benefit System. The federal government is the payer. Why? Because they're the employer. In a sense, the federal government sits as an employer just like every private sector employer does, and they pay a certain percentage of the employee's health care costs. Well, that's what we did for Medicare prescription drug. And as a result of that, you have to go out into the private sector, and you have all sorts of insurance plans that offer different prescription drug policies, and you can pick and choose the plan that fits you. Well, what happened as a result of that is that every year since that program has been in place, it has come underneath what the projection was by the Congressional Budget Office. It's actually saved money relative to that. Why? Because we have private sector competition out there. We need to basically take the Medicare prescription drug program, the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program, and apply it to the entire Medicare program, and which means that the individual is going to pay a percentage of the cost of their insurance, will have higher co-payments, have more involvement, more skin in the game when it comes to the cost of Medicare. Now, a lot of seniors, future seniors in particular, are not going to like that, but it's either do that or we're going to have to dramatically retrench into the benefits that are being offered.
Senator, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation has done an analysis of taking Treasury Department numbers of the unfunded liabilities of the United States. And they calculated that as of the end of fiscal 09, a lot of stuff has gone down since the end of fiscal 09, but as of the end of fiscal 09, the total unfunded liabilities are $61.9 trillion, which equals $200,000 for every one of the 308 million people in the United States. But of that, they say 38.8 trillion is Medicare, and of that 38.8 trillion, they say more than 8 trillion is for the Medicare prescription drug plan. So they argue, and I believe the actuaries demonstrate that going forward, the Medicare prescription drug plan that you like is $8 trillion in unfunded liabilities.
I like the way it was designed. I'm
Right.
not saying I look. There are things in that program I don't like. I mean, for example, I don't like them filling the donut hole. I don't. There are different policies within the Medicare prescription drug plan that, again, are not quote paid for. But if you're looking at a way to get a system that's going to extract savings from the rest of Medicare,
Right.
that design is a better design. The fact that we have benefits that are more generous than I believe are necessary is the reason the cost of the program is high.
Well, the same analysis shows $7.7 trillion in unfunded liabilities for the entire Social Security program. So that analysis has more unfunded liability for Medicare prescription drugs.
That's why I kept Social Security for last, because it's the one everybody goes to, but it's the smallest.
It's
problem.
easier to deal with in
And
terms of the size.
and it's easier to deal with in terms of the size.
So you voted for the Medicare prescription drug
Yeah,
plan.
I did.
And you're still happy with that vote?
Well,
You wouldn't take it back?
look. We had a Medicare program that did not include prescription drugs. That's like, no healthcare plan in America is sold that does include prescription
Right.
drugs. Why? Because in 1965, when the program was designed, there were not any kind of real prescription drugs out there that were used by the public, and we never changed the program to match the change in medicine.
Right.
It created a lot of perverse incentives where people would stay in the hospital more so they could get their drugs. It was just a bad system. We needed to add a prescription drug component. Having said that,
Right.
I argued with President Bush. I argued with the administration that we did not have to have a universal system. And they disagreed with me. And they said, nope, that's the only way we're going to get this passed. Secondly,
You would have said for poorer Medicare
Yes.
recipients, you would have
we had
subsidized drugs.
almost 90% of seniors had prescription drug coverage.
Right.
Well, let's design a program that picks up the 10%. That's what I wanted to do.
But you voted for Bush's plan anyway.
And I wanted to pay for it.
Right.
Neither of which I was successful in getting.
Right.
So I had to make the decision: do I vote against, I think, a fairly well-designed program that I'll get a private sector program, and have in that bill a health savings accounts, which I was very, very much for, because I believe that is the ultimate key to reforming the healthcare system and having that.
Let me ask you about that a second. So, in your view, should the next president roll back the Medicare prescription drug plan so that it only goes to poor seniors rather than everybody?
The next president should take the Medicare prescription drug plan and exact cost to bring the cost of that down. I don't think I would at this point. That I think we need to integrate the programs, not separate them out. And I think we need to integrate them all in a model that doesn't separate out prescription drugs from Medicare Part B, Medicare Part A. I think we need to have a Medicare program, a Medicare benefit, and we need to construct it in a way that allows for choices. So individuals can say, if I don't want a generous prescription drug benefit, if I have one for my business, I don't have to have one. So those are I think we need to create flexibility, and by creating flexibility, you can save money.
Okay, now you're raising 7 children, so I know that you're very critically aware of the fact that they face this burden of debt.
Yeah.
We've been talking about. It's not an abstract thing. $200,000 for that per person for every one of your 7 children for that $61.9 trillion unfunded liabilities. What would you like to see happen with your children as they go forward in life? Do you want to see them on the same kind of Medicare program that we have now? What do you want? What sort of program or what sort of free market system do you want to see them participate in?
Yeah, as I said before, I think the ultimate answer for Medicare is to turn it into more of a private sector looking plan where the federal government is the quote employer who pays a certain percentage of the cost of insurance. And you give the employee, the Medicare recipient, choices as to what type of program they'd like, and depending on their own facts and circumstances. For example, if I'm a retiree who happens to have a plan from my work that covers some prescription drugs, well, then I can have a plan that has less prescription drug coverage and maybe some long-term care. So you can adapt. So when you say, well, can we just limit it to those who don't have coverage? Well, you in a sense do that by allowing flexibility with the design of the plan, so people can buy the federal government has a fixed commitment of dollars that they can afford. And then the individual picks up the rest and then designs the plan that fits their needs.
So if you're a 22-year-old coming out of college today, you're getting a job, what do you want that person to do? What do you want the system that they're in to be?
I'm not too sure.
Well, you're saying they're going to pay payroll taxes, right?
Right.
They have to pay their Medicare payroll taxes to subsidize the people on Medicare right now.
Right.
We know that even the collective payroll tax of the entire workforce of the United States still in the long run is going to fall $8.8 trillion short. Are you saying that 43, 44 years from now, when the kid getting out of college this year is retiring, you still want a federal Medicare system in place? You just want this additional choice, but essentially you still want a Medicare system in place.
A Medicare system that reflects the cost, the cost that comes. So the answer is I don't think if you're maybe I think maybe should we abolish Medicare? No,
or move towards a more private system. You say you like
I think we do, but I think we do.
Savings accounts.
I think we do move toward a private system by having the federal government be simply the payer without having, which we have right now, which is the federal government, and the Medicare system is a single payer healthcare system by and large, with the exception of Medicare Advantage, which of course the administration is trying to get rid of. But right now, Medicare is a government-run healthcare program.
Right.
Under a Santorum, idea, it would no longer be a government-run healthcare system. It would be a system where the federal government stands in the place as an employer would stand in the place with an employee.
Okay.
And as a result of that, you can dial up and dial down the contribution you want to make to it, and allow you can do it means test wise. You can do all sorts of things to be able to save money under that plan. Much harder to do if it's a government-run system.
Okay, Social Security. What do you do about that?
Well, as you probably remember, Terry, when I was in the United States Senate, in fact, I was running for the United States Senate. I was one of the few guys who decided to touch the third rail of politics and go out and talk about Social Security reform. I did it in 1994. Almost lost my election because of it, because I went out and talked about, we needed to change the benefit structure and suggested that for younger people that we need to look at raising the retirement age. By the way, it's another thing we need to look at, eligibility for Medicare, which I didn't talk about. But clearly having Medicare eligibility at 65 and Social Security at 67 for generations doesn't really make any sense. I mean, so that's another reform, quote, that you could do with the Medicare. Those are very unpopular things, by the way.
Sure.
People don't want People would rather have it at 50. I mean, but the fact of the matter is Social Security was put in place in 1936 and average life expectancy was 61. Today, life expectancy is over 80. And the Social Security eligibility age has moved up 2 years, not 15 years. 19 years. And so we need to look at that issue. I think probably the easiest issue to solve is on the consumer price index versus the wage index. We should have Social Security benefits tied to what that benefit buys, not the wages of the people who are paying the taxes. And that alone can go a long way in saving a huge amount of money. We may or may not do the retirement age or the eligibility age. I just think it's a fairness issue. I think that's something that has to be on the table. Having said all that, when I went out and talked about it in 94, 95, 96, I talked about personal savings accounts. And I did so at a time when we had a 3.5% cushion. In other words, we were only using 9% of the 12.4% payroll tax for paying benefits. And I said, look, let's take that savings, let's take that money that's coming into the Social Security Trust Fund, that phony trust fund that's there, and use that and to get real assets for younger workers. And so I was an advocate for personal savings accounts. Here's the problem with personal savings accounts. There's no surplus anymore. There's no money. And so now we have to look at how do we transition from a system that is already going bankrupt and fund personal savings accounts. So that's a tough transition.
Leaving that question aside for a moment, I'm sure you're familiar with this legislation that John Sununu and Paul Ryan put together, which would allow people to take 6 points out of their 12.4% Social Security payroll tax and put it in mutual fund accounts, very conservative mutual fund accounts.
I supported and actually sponsored plans like that myself.
Similar sorts of plans. The actuary of Social Security scored that one and said that over the long run, Social Security would be solvent with the Sununu-Ryan plan. And at the end of the day, people would be required in that plan to buy an annuity that would pay them the equivalent of a Social Security benefit. If they didn't have enough money to buy that annuity, the federal government would make up the difference, but Social Security would still be solvent. There was a transition cost there. And off the top of my head, it's not as much as the debt has increased since Nancy Pelosi.
No, I understand that, but that's the big problem with that plan now, as opposed to before. That's why I talked about it, is that you could finance the transition costs back in the mid-'90s. That's why
without debt.
Without debt.
But philosophically, do you support the Ryan Sununu?
I philosophically support it. The problem is, how do you get there, given the mountain of debt that we're in right now and how we'd have to borrow more in the short term to make that happen.
Now, on the margin, do you think the increased debt of a transition to a Ryan Sununu type Social Security plan is a substantive problem for the country, or is a political problem in terms of trying to get that sort of plan through?
I think it's probably a little of both. I mean, I think it's certainly a political problem to go out there and call for fixing the Social Security problem by increasing the debt by potentially trillions of dollars in the short term. And as a result, I mean, you come forward with a plan in today's economy, and you're calling for $1 trillion increase in the debt. It's going to have a negative impact on the creditworthiness of this country and some of the economic impacts.
So given that the insolvency of Social Security, approximately $7.7 trillion, is not as great as Medicare, you would prefer to see a more incremental approach where you look at things like changing the retirement age, changing the COLA, maybe adjusting a few things like that to bring it down.
Look, it's really hard for me to say this because I've been a warrior on personal accounts for almost 20 years and really believe that's the best system and a better system. But we're in such an economic crunch right now with our debt. It's just hard to see how you get there. And this is the frustration. What I remember saying in 94, 96, I went on Air Force One. The only time I ever flew with Bill Clinton on Air Force One was to Kansas City, Missouri, where he had his first town hall meeting on Social Security, bipartisan. And I spoke for the United States Senate. And I said, look, we need to do something now. I said, the folks who are up there saying we don't need to do anything, you know what they want to do? They want to run the clock. They want to run the clock till 2011. And I said, what happens in 2011? I talked more about 2011 than any other year when I was in the United States Senate. Why? Because 2011 is the first year of the baby boomers turning 65. And I said, once they run the clock to 2011, the game is over. If they can get this thing not reformed, if they can stay away from personal accounts till 2011, it's going to make it virtually impossible for us to do it. So that was my call And now here we are, and so I even find myself constrained by the amount of debt that we would.
But another argument against, in favor of the sort of Social Security reform you advocated and Paul Ryan advocated, it's not just the fiscal problem of the debt. It's also the question of government dependence.
Absolutely.
According to the Social Security Administration, a majority of Americans over age 65 in this country rely on the federal government for a majority of their income through Social Security,
I agree.
meaning they are essentially wards of the state. They've paid payroll taxes their entire lives rather than spending that money on their own assets.
Terry, I've made this argument I don't know how many times, and that's the frustration I have. And
But is it worth fighting for? I mean, dealing with the debt and say, let's liberate seniors in America from government dependency.
Given the catastrophic levels of debt that we have right now, incurring trillions of dollars of additional debt in the short term, I think we need to get our house in order first. Okay. Before we embark on another huge debt bomb that we're going to drop on the United States. Look, I'm more passionate about this issue than you are, but I just look at the economic realities of this debt that we're facing that I just don't think we can pull that off in the short term.
Okay. Now, a major issue with the Tea Party in this last election cycle was the proper role of the federal government within the legitimate constraints of the Constitution. Back in January 1788, when the states were actually debating the draft Constitution that came out of the Constitution Convention, a big issue came up in Pennsylvania, among other places, that the General Welfare Clause, which is at the beginning of Article 1, Section 8, it says, the federal government can tax to provide for the common defense and general welfare, in combination with the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is at the bottom of Article 1, Section 8, and essentially says the federal government or Congress can pass laws, all laws necessary and proper to carry out these powers, would give the federal government essentially unlimited power. That was a fear that was expressed in the state conventions. That led to the move for a Bill of Rights. But this is what James Madison, in the midst of that debate in Federalist 45, James Madison trying to combat the idea that the Constitution without the Bill of Rights created unlimited federal government, said, quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution of the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which the last power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state." Now, Senator, Madison made that argument. He made it repeatedly, and yet even in his own state convention of Virginia, people said, well, we appreciate your saying that, but they, like Reagan, they said, trust but verify.
Trust but verify.
And they put into the Constitution, Madison himself, the 10th Amendment, that says powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states and the people. When you look at the federal government today, what are those things that conspicuously you see it doing that you believe violate Madison's sense and the framer's sense of a Constitution that strictly limited the government to the delegated powers of the Constitution?
Well, I mean, there's a whole host of things that the federal government has taken on that were customarily state duties and has involved themselves more and more in it. And candidly, it's things that we should begin to wind ourselves down from. Everything from a lot of the, as I did when I was in the Congress, the social welfare programs. There's still a whole host of those types of programs that the federal government should be winding itself out of. And
you question whether they were constitutional in the first place?
Look, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I would say that those are things that the federal government did because, well, we just weren't happy with what the states were doing and we decided we could do it better, which is not a good reason to do something. Mm-hmm. Education is another area where
does the Constitution give the federal government a delegated power over primary and secondary education?
Obviously not.
It doesn't?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't.
So the Department of Education is unconstitutional.
The Department of Education is, in my opinion, unnecessary,
right,
and overseeing a state bureaucracy, which is already a big problem.
But does the federal government, leaving aside the political realities or possibilities of actually abolishing the Department of Education, did the Constitution delegate to the federal government the powers that are now exercised by the Department of Education?
I think not just the Department of Education. I think there's a lot of areas within the federal government that the federal government is involved, which the Constitution never contemplated. Mm-hmm. Does that mean they're unconstitutional? Well, I mean that's a Supreme Court decision. That's not Rick Santorum's decision.
Well, if you were Supreme Court
But-
justice, what would you say?
Well, I'm not a Supreme Court justice, so I'm not going to answer that question
All right.
because that's a lot more. That's a loaded and complicated answer. But what I would say is that what we need to do is look at areas that we need to divest ourselves from that are not just extra constitutional, but things that the federal government simply isn't good at, and we shouldn't be doing anyway. That they really are within the purview of the states and the purview of the private sector. And so I would look at an opportunity across the federal government at trying to reduce the programmatic areas that we are involved in. And education, to me, is as good as one as any. I voted for No Child Left Behind. The reason I voted for No Child Left Behind, one reason. For years and years and years, we would say, our education system isn't working, it's failing, look at the results. And the teachers unions and others say, well, it's not true, you can't, it's not, you're looking at this and you look at apples and oranges and all this stuff. And the reason I voted for the No Child Left Behind bill is because for the first time we would actually get a measurement that we could use across the board, and we could actually find out whether what we believed was true was true. Now, there were a lot of other things in that bill that I deplored, but I voted for it because I thought, well, we need to get the facts, and we need to have some national system be able to determine whether we are in fact succeeding or failing. Well, guess what? We're failing. And so
federal education spending has incredibly increased since No Child Left Behind.
I disagree with that. I think that.
But do you take back your vote, or do you still support?
I like the vote in the sense that now you see the left, I don't know if you saw Waiting for Superman, but now everybody, it's sort of in some respects have to give No Child Left Behind credit for this. Now everybody's recognized primary and secondary education is a failure in America. And at the heart of it is the teachers' unions. At the heart of it is government-run education. And that's why the move for charter schools, the move for homeschooling, private schools, is even taking wing among moderates and on the left. I don't think that would have happened, frankly, had we not had No Child Left Behind. So while I disagree with a lot of the policy in there, I certainly disagree with a lot of the money that was in there. The fact that we've now formed a consensus because we now know we have failure in that level is a starting point now let's see if we can do something about the public education.
But hasn't the federal government itself shown it can do nothing to improve education?
I'm not arguing that.
I
say before that the only thing that the federal government has shown that they can do well is actually show that we don't do it well.
If there's one place in the country that Congress actually has legitimate jurisdiction over the public schools, it's in the District of Columbia, which is in the federal city. And one thing that the Department of Education does do, it has an agency called the National Center for Educational Statistics. And according to the National Center for Educational Statistics, the District of Columbia spends more money per pupil in its public schools than any state, and has the absolute lowest test scores of any state. What does that tell you about federal involvement in the schools?
Well, what it tells you about money being the answer to the problems in the schools. So look, the federal government should not be running the D.C. schools. The federal government should be running any schools. I mean, I believe that we need to change the entire educational system to one that is not government run, but parent-centered, and that we have my ideal world is that a parent comes in to see the superintendent or somebody in the public school system, and you sit down with the parents and say, Mr. and Mrs. Jeffries, you have how many children?
5.
5 children. I said.
They don't go to government schools.
And they don't. Well, but that's okay because under the Santorum plan, they wouldn't have.
It's not okay when I pay my property.
No. Look, I'm doing the same thing, pal. in both in Pennsylvania and Virginia, I have 2 homes. So look, what a system should look like is if I'm the superintendent, I say to you, I said, look, what can I do? What can we do as the government education system to help each one of your children achieve and succeed the way you would like them to achieve and succeed? And it wouldn't be to say, well, you have to come to this school. Here's resources that we have available to help your child. Money. Now, if you'd like your children to go to private school, we can do that. If you'd like the children to go to parochial school, we can do that. If you'd like your children to be homeschooled, we can help you with that. If you want your children to come to this school,
total school choice.
It's not about school choice.
But why not?
That's too small a term, in my opinion. It's a radical idea that you, the parent, have the responsibility to educate your child, And the government should be there to help you design a program that what's best for your children.
Let's start with the District of Columbia, for example. President Obama and Arne Duncan, the current Secretary of Education, they canceled the limited school choice program in D.C. But Congress has jurisdiction over D.C. under the Constitution. There's something like $15,000 or $16,000 they spend per pupil for every student in the D.C. schools, and as I said, they had the lowest test scores. Why not divide up that $15,000, $16,000, simply give it to every single parent in the District of Columbia and allow them to choose where they send their child to school, even if it's in Virginia or Maryland?
That's a crude way of talking about what I just was suggesting, but yes, I mean, look, I'm for.
You in favor of that?
I'm for school. I've been for school choice from the very beginning. I've sponsored school choice bills. Believe that, again, we should have parent-centered, not child-centered, parent-centered education. Parents should do what's right, should work with the schools and work with the government to be able to get the resources to the children that the parent believes are best for the child.
If they actually bring the check to the school will be more inclined to listen to the parent.
As I said, it's a very crude way of getting across what
and you believe that should be done on a state-by-state basis?
Look, I'm for even a more radical idea than that. I mean, I'm for the idea of actually having the entire system designed around facilitating a parent designing the program, helping the parent design a program that's best for their children, irrespective of just, here's $1 for a school, but, it may not be $1 for a school. It may be that your child could benefit from the music education program at the public school, but, wants to homeschool some, wants to go to a private school for some things. So just handing a check is a crude way of what really we should be doing, which is customizing. We do this for special needs kids. In a lot of respects, we have IEPs that help design specialized programs for children with disabilities, but we don't do it for the average kid. Right. We need to do it for all children.
So you wouldn't put, or would you, put sort of a class war construct over it and say once someone makes over X amount of income, even if they have 7 children, they're not welcome in this program?
Of course not.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. This is sort of transitioning to social and cultural issues. Anyway, let's go to another founding father, Senator. Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. And about 50 years later, when he was an old man, he wrote a letter to a fellow Virginian, Henry Lee, explaining the Declaration of Independence, why he wrote it. He said that one of the inspirations for the Declaration of Independence was the Roman senator Cicero. And Alexander Hamilton used Cicero's middle name as a pseudonym at times, Tully, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Russell Kirk, the great conservative, said that Cicero had more influence over the founding fathers than any other classical thinker. Let me quote you what Cicero said about law. Cicero said, "There is a true law, a right reason, conformable to nature, universal, unchangeable, eternal, whose commands urge us to duty and whose prohibitions restrain us from evil. Whether it enjoins or forbids, the good respect its injunctions and the wicked treat them with indifference. This law cannot be controlled by any other law and is not liable either to derogation or abrogation. Neither the Senate nor the people can give us any dispensation for not obeying this universal law of justice. It needs no other expositor or interpreter than our own conscience. It is not one thing at Rome and another at Athens, one thing today and another tomorrow, but in all times and nations this universal law must forever reign, eternal and imperishable. It is sovereign master and emperor of all things. God himself is its author, its promulgator, its enforcer. He who obeys it not, flies from himself, and does violence to the very nature of man," unquote. Now, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton agreed with Cicero. Do you agree with Cicero?
Absolutely. I mean, I refer to it as the natural law, not the universal law, but the natural law. And it's in the hearts of every man. But, one of the things I talk about, in fact, I gave a speech in Houston in September, where it was the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's speech in Houston to the Houston Ministerial Association. It was a couple of months before his election in 1960. He went out and said, he wasn't going to be, the Pope's puppet as president, because there was a concern at the time that this Catholic would be a papist, and that somehow the Catholics would have this cabal and run the United States of America. But what Kennedy did there was he didn't just divorce himself from the Pope. He basically threw religion under the bus and basically said that this is his term. He said, "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute." Well, that's not America. It never has been America. It's France. It's Turkey, but it's not America. And what Cicero is referring to is really that, which is there are two laws. There's the secular law, There's man-made laws. And then there's a higher law. There's the sacred law, the universal law, the natural law. That we learn in America by and large through faith, through the moral code that faith teaches it, but is discernible through the philosophers too, to right reason. And that law is one that sits over the secular law, and that one we have to achieve. So when we had slavery in this country, slavery did not conform to the natural law, and as a result, there was agitation always. Abortion doesn't conform to the natural law. Why? Because we don't. All life should be respected, and so this agitation of having laws that are secular laws inconsistent with the natural law is something that we've dealt with in America from its very founding. But we have to recognize that there's a place for the articulation of the sacred law, or the natural law, or the universal law, and that they need to be in the public square, and they need to be involved in political discourse, because there are moral components to every single law we pass.
Dr. Martin Luther King, when he was thrown in the Birmingham jail,
I quoted it in my speech.
In 1963, on Good Friday, wrote his letter from the Birmingham jail. And in that, he cited two Roman Catholic saints, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, as saying that a just law is a law that comports with the natural law or the law of God. And an unjust law is one that doesn't. And the reason that the segregation laws of the South were unjust is because they violated the natural God-given law.
That's
Do you
right.
agree with Martin Luther King?
Absolutely. I quoted it in my speech. I mean, in fact, read the entire quote. And I believe that we have an obligation, and the call in my speech was for what Madison referred to as the perfect remedy. In essence, what freedom of conscience is all about, what you're talking about is all about, is how do we live with our differences? If you think about it, America is unique in the sense that we have people coming from very disparate backgrounds, very different points of view, and yet we have a equanimity here in America. We always figure out a way to sort of work things out in America. Why? Why does someone from Serbia and someone from Croatia, that if they lived in the Balkans would be at each other's throats, move next door to each other in Cleveland and are in the PTA together and get along? How does that work? Well, it works because America is different. It's Madison's perfect remedy, which is a vibrant, active, inclusive public square. Everybody's allowed in. People of faith, people of non-faith, and you can make your claims, you can argue your point, and then you can let the discourse decide. You don't have the elite, the planners, the smart people saying, no, this is how we're going to do things. And if the sacred law and the secular law don't match up, as the Supreme Court has done now on numerous occasions, whether it's marriage or abortion or a whole host of other issues, they've sort of pulled that discussion, that perfect remedy, and pulled the plug on it and said, no, we're going to impose our remedy, an imperfect one based upon the elites of our culture.
All right, let's talk in specific terms about how this natural God-given law that is at the foundation of our country plays into current concrete issues. We asked House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, I think I mentioned it to you earlier, this past summer, whether she believed Jesus had a right to life from the moment of conception. Did Jesus have a right to life from the moment of conception?
Every person, every child conceived in the womb has a right to life from the moment of conception. Why? Because they are human, genetically human. At the moment of conception, they have the same genetic composition as you and I do from that moment on, and it's alive. So it is human by genetic, and it is alive. So it's a human life. So the question is not whether this is a human life. When Barack Obama was asked, is a child in the womb a human life? Well, that's above my pay grade. Just about everything else in the world he's willing to do, to have the government do, but he can't answer that basic question, which is not a debatable issue at all. I don't think you'll find a biologist in the world who will say that is not a human life. The question is, and this is what Barack Obama didn't want to answer, is that human life a person under the Constitution? And Barack Obama says no. Well, if that person, human life, is not a person, then I find it almost remarkable for a black man to say, no, we're going to decide who are people and who are not people.
This is apropos, Senator, of language that's been in the Republican national platform since 1984. It was put there under President Ronald Reagan, who very much believed in it. There's been fight over this language virtually every convention since then. It says, faithful to the first guarantee of the Declaration of Independence, we assert the inherent dignity and sanctity of all human life and affirm that the unborn child has a fundamental individual right to life which cannot be infringed. We support a human life amendment to the Constitution, and we endorse legislation to make clear that the 14th Amendment's protections apply to unborn children. We oppose using public revenues to promote or perform abortions and will not fund organizations which advocate it. We support the appointment of judges who respect traditional family values and the sanctity and dignity of innocent human life. First of all, do you agree with that, Plank?
I do, and we should keep it the same. And as you know, there's probably no one who went out and fought on the judges issue in the Senate more than I did. I fought and made it an important issue. But prior to my involvement in the Republican leadership, if you recall, the Priscilla Owen and Janice Rogers Brown and a whole bunch of others, and then eventually Supreme Court nominees, we as Republicans basically we were out to lunch on judges. We didn't understand how important they were, and the fact that they did not have respect for the Constitution. They did not have respect for how the Declaration and how our founding rights were inculcated into that Constitution. And I fought for those things, and I will continue to do so in the future.
The Plank calls for legislation to make clear the 14th Amendment rights apply to the unborn child. You were talking about President Obama did not want to recognize the personhood of an unborn child. That specific language says that an unborn child is a person.
In fact, there are, as you know, there are movements now in the states, personhood movements in the states to try to get that very language included.
And you support that?
Yeah.
All right, now, some people would argue, some pragmatists would argue, that a child conceived through rape or incest, is that a person?
Yes.
So a child conceived through rape or incest has equal protection of the law.
A child is a child. I mean, to do violence to a child because of the way that baby was conceived, I understand. Look,
that child deserves the same protection from the state as a child conceived by a married couple.
It's about the child, okay? And I understand that there are obviously horrible consequences of dealing with the psychological and physical ramifications of rape and incest. But again, what we have to, and I did this from my debates on the floor of the Senate with partial birth abortion, which, as you know, I led the charge on for many years. And one of the most important aspects of that legislation was not that it was going to be a huge pro-life victory and that we were going to save millions of babies because of banning this procedure, which ultimately we did, but that debate focused America on something that for a long time they've been lied to about, which is that blob of tissue in the womb is a little baby. And with a partial birth abortion, when the baby is 20 weeks old, you can't miss the baby. I mean, the baby is being extracted from the womb alive. Arms, legs, toes, fingers, fingernails, as the movie Juno pointed out, and then is executed. So that moment that we had in the late 90s changed the debate in America. For the first time since Roe versus Wade, attitudes on abortion began to change. Young people who grew up during that era have a very different view of abortion as a result of that. Why? Because we are now, through sonograms, recognizing the humanity of the child in the womb. And it's not that we don't care about mothers. It's a tragic, horrible situation with rape and incest. But we need to deal with the mother and of all mothers, not just rape and incest, but of all mothers who are going through an unwanted pregnancy in a compassionate and caring way and a supportive way as possible. But we can't lose sight of the fact that there's another human being.
So you think we're on our way to winning the fight for life in the United States?
I don't think there's any question. If you look at attitudes of young people, look, this is a very visual generation. Gen Y is a very visual generation, and you go to that screen and you look, go by their own refrigerator, and they'll see the picture of them when they were 6 weeks old, and you can say, well, that's not a person. Well, that's me. Yeah, that's a person. You can't say that abortion's okay. It's not okay, because that could be me. In fact, people today, and I don't know how much I'm not a Gen Y person, but I don't know how many people today in sitting in the classroom in college look around and say, there's 1/3 of the people who should be here aren't here because of abortion.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about fixing Social Security and Medicare?
Have more babies.
I mean,
the
system was built on the fact that we would always have an increasing population. And if that would be the case, we'd have been fine, but we aren't.
Senator, marriage between a man and a woman, Is that a part of that natural,
Absolutely.
God-given law?
Absolutely. I mean, it's very, very clear. I mean, it's nature. Men and women, are coming together in a bond of marriage, having children is at the core and basis of the survival of any civilization.
So 2 men or 2 women marrying each other, is that a violation of the natural law?
I believe it is.
Should the state sanction that? Should it allow it?
Well, no. The state should sanction what is in the best interest of the state and create special privileges. Marriage is a recognition of the natural law and a recognition that there is a benefit to society for men and women uniquely to get married, to have children, and raise those children in a stable environment. That's a unique benefit to society.
Now, in the actual federal court decision that came down in the district court in San Francisco, the judge out there, in fact, said that children do not need and do not have a right to a mother and a father. Does a child have a God-given natural right to a mother and father?
They have, well, children have natural mothers and fathers. Do they have a right? Should society do their best to make sure that that child has the best opportunity to be raised by that mother and father? The answer is yes.
If a father walks away from a child...
I get a little nervous about rights, because then you're talking about constitutional rights.
If a father walks away from a child he has conceived, is he violating the natural law and avoiding a duty?
Yes.
Okay. If a mother walks away from a child she has conceived. So the parents... The mother
and
father have a duty.
Of course, you have a duty to your child. I mean, if you're going to engage in an activity that could result in fathering or mothering a child, then you have a responsibility to that child.
Okay, now if the state takes a child and sticks it into a same-sex couple and allows that same-sex couple to adopt that child, is the state violating the rights of that child?
I would say that the state is doing a disservice to that child and violating the rights. In the sense, I guess it depends. I mean, if there's no mother and father, there's no natural mother and father, you can't be violating the right to a child.
Well, doesn't every child have a natural mother and father somewhere?
But it may be an orphan. I mean, there's all sorts of situations where they may or may not. I mean, so I can't say in every case that's the case. But what I can say is that the state is not doing a service to the child and to society by not putting that child in a home where there is a mother and a father. Men are different than women. Mothers are different than fathers. I'm raising 7 children.
A disservice to society or to the child?
Both.
Okay.
And that I can tell you that fathers bring something different to their daughters than mothers do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are not just genetically different. We are different beings. I mean, men are different than women. Men think different than women. They act different than women. Not all, as a general rule. And they bring different things. I mean, this is common sense. Mm-hmm. This is nature. And what we're trying to do is defy nature because a certain group of people want to be affirmed by society. And I just don't think that's to the benefit of society or to the child.
Same-sex marriage should be prohibited.
Yeah, there should be no same-sex marriage.
And the state handing over babies to same-sex couples, should that be prohibited?
Yes. I mean, I don't believe in same-sex adoption, nor do I believe in same-sex marriage.
Now, Senator, I'd like to turn to national security policy. Going back to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution says that Congress shall have the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Now, back in 1787, in the Constitutional Convention, when that issue came up, the original draft of the Constitution said that Congress shall have the power to make war. And James Madison, in his notes from the convention, made the following notation. Mr. Madison and Mr. Jerry moved to insert declare, striking out make war, leaving to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks. Mr. Sherman thought it stood very well. The executive should be able to repel and not to commence war, quote unquote. In other words, the framers, according to Madison's notes, originally were looking at giving Congress the whole power of war, but then they decided that they would change it from make to declare in order to give the president the power to repel sudden attacks. When you were in Congress, you voted twice to authorize the use of force overseas, once in Afghanistan and once in Iraq. And there were some people who counseled President Bush that he did not need the authorization of Congress, that he could have put armies in the field in Afghanistan and Iraq without congressional authorization. Where do you stand on that? Did he need your approval?
I thought he should get the approval of the Congress. I thought it was important for the president to conduct any kind of major military conflict action that was going to commit substantial resources and lives of our troops before the Congress and have it debated before the American public. What's the difference? It's a very difficult analysis as to, a small military encounter for, that we may do something like was unfortunately in Somalia versus a major commitment of resources. And I think when it comes to a major commitment of resources, the president should come to Congress, and Congress should do a resolution of approval.
So the bottom line is there's no way the president could have initiated a war in Iraq and Afghanistan without prior approval from Congress.
Again, it's a tricky situation. I would say that if there was a need for the president to get involved in an activity around the world, anywhere around the world, not just repelling an invasion, but striking into a foreign country, if there's a timeliness to it that would enhance the security of our country, then I would say that the declaration part of the Constitution means the Congress states what is so, to declare something such. That there's one thing that if there's needs to be action prior to a declaration, but I think to conduct a campaign, to conduct a war, as opposed to an isolated strike or something that may be necessary because of a timely situation, then he should go to Congress.
Well,
I don't want to limit the president's power to act, if necessary, quickly before Congress deliberates and decides in order to preserve the security of the country.
Well, let me give you a possible real-world place to draw the line. In Grenada, there were U.S. medical students who were in imminent danger. And there was a treaty organization to which the United States belonged, where signatories were saying, we want your help there. There are Cuban communist forces on the ground building an air base that could have launched planes that could reach and attack the United States.
And Ronald Reagan acted.
And Ronald Reagan acted. He went in there. He protected those medical students.
And he didn't go to the Congress.
He did not go to the Congress, but he did not launch a protracted war.
Right, but that's a different situation. That's a better example than Somalia, frankly. That's a situation where we went in for a isolated, specific purpose that the probability of a long-term war was actually pretty limited.
So if you were counsel to Ronald Reagan and someone said, Mr. Reagan, James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution, in his own notes in the Constitutional Convention, said the president could repel a sudden attack.
Well, I would make the argument that when you're out there defending American citizens, that's from a potential attack, that's repelling an attack. While not on American soil, certainly the interests of America.
Okay, this was within the spirit of the Constitution, defending America in imminent threat.
I think the spirit of the Constitution was to give the president the flexibility to act in the national security interests of the country if a pressing situation occurred. If it's an isolated one, that's easy. Then you never have to go to Congress. If it's a potential for a protracted one, that doesn't mean the president still has to wait. He can act if there's a need to act promptly, but then follow up if it's going to be a long commitment and get the Congress.
And that line exists somewhere between Reagan's move on Grenada, which
is, to me, is a clear-cut one.
And on the other side of the line, clearly, is George Bush invading Afghanistan.
Correct, and it's one of those things that we will be debating, and hopefully in the future we won't have to be debating, but I suspect at some point in the future of America we will again.
Well, let me give you another real historical case. Harry Truman committed the United States to a war in Korea after the UN had approved such a war, but before the United States Congress had done so. Was that legitimate?
My feeling is he should have come to the United States Congress and asked for its approval to authorize the war.
Okay. Now, earlier in this discussion, Senator, we talked about Cicero's articulation of the natural law, the fact that the Founding Fathers universally shared that view, and that Americans up to and including Martin Luther King, for example, understood that a just law is something that's consistent with the natural moral law which comes from God. There's also a moral law, it seems to me, that governs our actions in regards to other states, as well as our actions in regards to ourselves. And historically, there's been what's known as the just war theory, and how you justify whether a nation can actually use military force to defend its interests. And 4 prongs that have historically been put forward for that theory are: there must be a serious threat to your security. It can't be something moderate. There has to be a serious threat to damage. It also has to be a last resort. You can't immediately go to use of military force. You have to exhaust other means that plausibly can solve the problem before you use military force. There has to be a reasonable prospect of success. Right. That is, you have to do a prudential analysis and say, yes, it is reasonable that we can actually achieve the end here through the use of military force. And finally, the use of military force, according to traditional just war theory, must avert more evil than it actually ends up causing through a reasonable analysis. You accept this?
I do. I mean, in fact, I'm familiar with just war theory. I applied those tenets to the decisions that I made, particularly the one I made in Iraq, because it was some would say, a tougher analysis than certainly the first time that I did it, which was the first Iraq War. Actually, it was the first vote I cast as a member of Congress back in 1991, was to go to war with Iraq and over Kuwait. So yes, I do. I did apply those, and I think you used the term with respect to item 3, which you said you used the term prudential judgment. Each one of those is a prudential judgment. I mean, there's no clear cut. It may be some may be clearer than others, but all of them are prudential judgments as to what how the facts apply to those circumstances. Those theories.
In the first Iraq War with the senior President Bush, which he voted to authorize in the U.S. House of Representatives, there you had Saddam Hussein had invaded a neighbor. And that neighbor was asking us to defend them. And clearly Kuwait had there was serious damage to Kuwait, and they had a just reason. It was reasonable to think that it was a last resort, and there was also good reason to think that the United States would succeed, which they did in very limited war aims that in the end George Herbert Walker Bush refused to exceed. He did not want to go all the way into Iraq and remove the regime of Saddam Hussein. The second Iraq War, it's a little bit more intense debate, is it not?
No, I said it was a much tougher analysis to sort of see your way through that, but it was a very different time than what we had in 1991. In 1991, we weren't attacked. People now looking back at 2003 think in terms of 9 years after the events of 9/11. But this was 18 months after the events of 9/11. We're having this debate. And the entire debate at the time, if you recall, was a condemnation of Bush, and to some degree Clinton, but more Bush, for not having connected the dots. That was the term of the day. Mm-hmm. That we had all of this intelligence that pointed to that we were going to be attacked, and the intelligence community didn't get it. They didn't do proper analysis. They didn't synthesize it. The president didn't act upon this intelligence, and so of course we then create this huge new superstructure, the DNI and everything else, which of course doesn't solve any. I would argue makes the problem even worse, which we can get into. I know that's a separate situation, but we have created so many levels of analysis within our intelligence community. To me, it's completely unworkable. But the point I'm getting at, in 2003, we were, how can we let this raw intelligence, in some cases raw intelligence, in other cases real analysis and that's been worked through by the intel community, and we see these dots connected, and how do we not act? We have to act before someone attacks us.
All right, so
given the gravity of the attack that could be waged.
Applying this just war theory, what was the serious threat that Saddam Hussein, in your perception, posed to the United States in 2003?
Well, everything from sponsoring and supporting terrorists that would attack Israel in particular, which we knew that was obvious he was doing that. He had a bounty out for Israeli heads, if you will, for $25,000 for any family whose son or daughter would commit a suicide bomb in the state of Israel. So we knew that he was a sponsor of terrorism. The most, at the time, the most prolific sponsor of terrorism, Islamic terrorism. We also knew that he had possessed chemical and biological weapons and had used them in the past, and said did not deny that he had them and would use them again in the future. At least we were concerned about that. And the impact of that in the region, which was a very destabilized region, as you know, at the time. And then the fear of his influence in destabilizing the entire area as we were trying to deal with Afghanistan. Finally, the whole issue of whether he had other weapons of mass destruction that we were dealing with. But there were a whole variety of things that would lead, again, to connecting the dots that he could help project terror and other terrorist threats into not just Israel, but to Europe and to the United States.
And now, of course, it came out after the fact that the CIA was wrong. He had not stockpiled weapons of mass destruction. They were not found by the...
I would argue that not only the CIA was wrong, but the Mossad was wrong, that the British were wrong, the French were wrong,
right.
The Germans were wrong, the Chinese were wrong. I mean, everybody was wrong.
It was a horrendous intelligence failure.
Right.
Now, looking back retrospectively, given the intelligence failure, given what we found out after we invaded, do you still think that Saddam was a serious enough threat to the security of the United States?
See, that's an invalid question. I mean, that you can't.
Well, why is it invalid? I mean, we have to learn from history.
Had I known that the Steelers were going to blitz, would you have run along a long
that's not my
pattern?
question. I can stipulate that given what the CIA was telling the Senate at the time, that you believe there is a significant threat sufficient enough to justify a preemptive invasion of Iraq. But what I'm asking is, given what we know now, after the invasion, after we discovered the intelligence failure, if we knew the truth, would there have been a sufficient?
I think we would have had more time to use other measures. So the answer is, would I have felt that there was an urgency to act, to do what we did, given what we knew after the fact? I would say there probably was not the urgency to act that we did.
It wouldn't have been a last resort.
It wouldn't have. That's the area that would have fallen short.
So if the intelligence community had not failed the political community in the United States at that time, war would not have been justified.
I think it would not have qualified as a last resort. There would have been other options available to us.
So
there was a concern. There was a concern, and again, had we had better intelligence, we would have known that Iran was not violating UN sanctions.
Right.
There was also the issue of repeated UN sanctions, repeated attempts by Iraq not to follow through with what they had promised to do.
Right.
Had we known that they had actually followed through on what they promised to do, even though they said they didn't.
They were bluffing.
They were bluffing, which I mean,
they were bluffing that they were violating the sanctions.
I mean, it's the most. That's why looking back, why would they bluff of something that they're not doing and say that they're doing? So
but
it was irrational conduct.
That's the fact that we could make such a huge mistake to actually initiate a war, preemptively invade another country, and cause a significant amount of damage based on false intelligence. Point to the need for intensified prudential analysis of this kind of thing, including the quality of the intelligence.
It points to, more importantly, I think it points to the need of better intelligence. I think the analysis was intense, and you can dig and dig and dig, and if the intelligence is faulty, if the intelligence is then you're still going to come up with the same analysis, whether it's intense or not intense. I think it was intense.
So some people might have argued that Congress should have had more intense oversight over the CIA and other intelligence agencies, have a better handle on whether they were doing a good job.
Terry, I mean, here we go again. How many layers, Terry?
Well, do you think
the problem is, I think we need. I haven't looked at this carefully enough to be able to say, well, here's my intelligence reorganization idea.
Right.
And so I hesitate to say that. But what I would say is we need to cut it dramatically. We need to get rid of layers and layers and layers. The more people you get, the more avenues and cross checks and reports and everything else, the less good intelligence you get, not the more.
Right.
And I think that's true on a lot of areas in government, not just intelligence.
I was just looking at part of President George W. Bush's book, and he was explaining why he approved the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And in his explanation, he said that most of what we knew about al-Qaeda actually came from the interrogation of al-Qaeda after we captured them in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Which another way of saying that is we really didn't know much about al-Qaeda from our intelligence prior to that.
Well, I think what we did know is that our intelligence in that area of the world prior to 9/11 was weak. and that we, at least my recollection was, that we relied more on Israeli intelligence and British intelligence than we did on our own intelligence. Because, as you recall, we went through a lot of intelligence reforms back in the 70s, in particular, and that had dire consequences to this country and our ability to collect human intelligence in areas of the world that were a threat to us.
The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that reviewed what happened in Iraq said that we had no human intelligence sources in Iraq before the war.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Afghanistan and the same just war criteria. Here, serious threat was a last resort, reasonable prospect of success, averts more evil than it causes.
I think that was pretty square on all of them, and this was a country that clearly attacked it, used resources within that regime to support an attack on the United States, and certainly threatened to do more of it. I mean, there was no question about it, and so to avert further attacks, to respond to the attack that was already leveled on the country, and to avoid further attacks, you remove the place that was the petri dish for this type of activity.
And all of that, of course, was in self-defense. It was a response against an actual attack.
Against a national attack.
Against the people who were actually responsible for carrying out the attack and were complicit with the organization that did so. Now, in his second inaugural address on January 20th, 2005, George Bush stood up behind the Capitol and he said the following words: "So it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world. The great objective of ending tyranny," he said, "is the concentrated work of generations. The difficulty of the task is no excuse for avoiding it." That's what George Bush said. I want to read you something that Jeane Kirkpatrick wrote years before that. In 1979, she wrote an article in Commentary magazine, very critical of Jimmy Carter's policy towards Iran, where there was a revolution against a pro-American authoritarian in Central America. Ronald Reagan got that article from Richard Allen, who became his first national security advisor. He loved it. He ended up making Jeane Kirkpatrick his UN ambassador. Jeane Kirkpatrick said, "Although most governments in the world are, as they always have been, autocracies of one kind or another, no idea holds greater sway in the mind of educated Americans than the belief that it's possible to democratize governments anytime, anywhere, under any circumstances. This notion," Kirkpatrick said, "is belied by an enormous body of evidence based on the experience of dozens of countries which have attempted, with more or less, usually less success, to move from autocratic to democratic governments. Many of the wisest political scientists of this and previous centuries agree that democratic institutions are especially difficult to establish and maintain because they make heavy demands on all portions of a population and because they depend on complex social, cultural, and economic conditions," unquote. Who do you think was right? George W. Bush in his second inaugural address, or Jeane Kirkpatrick?
I don't find them to be mutually exclusive. I think I agree with I agree with both statements in the sense that Kirkpatrick is right. Democracy is hard. It takes complex institutions. It doesn't fit in all cultures. But Bush is also right that democracies tend to not have the ability to project power and to cause problems with their neighbors and to be enemies of the United States. So where we can and where it can work, then we should promote democracies. But we should not, as Kirkpatrick says, we should not fall into the folly that democracies can, at this point in time, work everywhere. And we need to look at places where that institution, either institutions that can support democracy already exist, and then seek that kind of. For example, in Western civilization, I think the ground is reasonably fertile for democracies to exist and to thrive. In places like the Islamic world, it is much more difficult. Much more difficult.
I won't quote her directly, but in her final book, Making War to Keep the Peace, which was published posthumously, Jeane Kirkpatrick was very critical of George Bush's foreign policy. And she wanted to clarify what the Reagan Doctrine was and how it worked. And she pointed out their prudential analysis of where this could be advanced. And you had the Reagan Doctrine happening in Poland, where you had solidarity in a Roman Catholic country. You had it in Central America. you could argue that Afghanistan is quite a different location and culture than that. Do you think it is folly for the United States to try and use military force to establish a democracy in Afghanistan?
I think it's going to be very, very hard. I mean, grafting democracy onto an Islamic country is particularly Islamic countries in the Middle East, which practice a more of a Salafi brand of Islam. That's a difficult thing, because that brand of Islam says that that Sharia which is the God-given law dictated to the Prophet by Allah, is complete and perfect and cannot be added to or subtracted from.
So is Sharia law consistent with democratic government?
In the certainly with the Islamist, no. With Taliban and Al Qaeda and Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabis, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. Sharia law is the complete law, and there's no room for man-made law. So are there areas within the Muslim world that are not as, I hate to use the word orthodox or extreme, whatever you want to call it, that where democracy can work? Yes.
Where?
But there's a cultural underpinnings that may make that, take for example Abu Dhabi or someplace like that, which is more of a hybrid. Now, obviously, they're not a democracy.
They're an emirate.
They're an emirate, not a democracy.
You have a lot of guest workers in that country who have very little freedom at all.
But could it work in a place that's more westernized like that? Could it work in a place maybe like Indonesia or someplace like that? Potentially, much more so than it would. And it's a much harder lift, and I admitted that from day one in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Iraq is different, but it's than Afghanistan, which is very tribal and very difficult.
But in Afghanistan is a very real and concrete question for people today.
And it's a tough one.
At CNSnews.com, we've maintained a database of all U.S. casualties in Afghanistan. It's based primarily on the Defense Department casualty reports. A majority of the casualties in that war, which is now in its 10th year, have taken place since the inauguration of Barack Obama.
People forget we only had a few hundred troops in Afghanistan at the time that the war was fought the first
time.
And
the casualty rate was very low.
Well, we only had a few hundred troops. We didn't have very many casualties. We didn't have very many people.
In 2010, there were almost, not quite, 500 U.S. casualties in Afghanistan.
30,000 troops.
American dying every 18 hours in that country. If, in fact, we've removed the Taliban, Al Qaeda is no longer using that as a base to attack the United States, why are we losing one American life every 18 hours in Afghanistan?
Well, because we have not established a stable government that controls the country, and I think your point is, well, do we need to have a democracy in place to do that? There are some who've suggested there was a king in Afghanistan before the Russians came in and before sort of disrupted everything, and he was someone that was able to sort of coordinate things and make things work. Would it be okay to return to that form of government? I think going forward we need to be open to a form of government that works for a place like Afghanistan. Is democracy again the ideal? All things being equal, yes, but in this case, I'm not too sure all things are equal.
So the justification for the U.S. to remain in Afghanistan now and continue to lose the lives of some young Americans is to make sure that we leave there with a stable government.
We leave there not with the likelihood that when we leave, a government is reconstituted that will do the same thing that the government before we got there did.
So on the margin, if we could move our troops into places where they're not as much risk, they're not necessarily engaging Taliban insurgents or patrolling the Pakistan border, but they're maintaining the stability of the government in Kabul, we'd be achieving our strategic goal perhaps with fewer lost lives.
And I think what we were finding is when we were performing functions on a more limited basis, that was not succeeding. That what was we saw the reestablishment of the Taliban within lots of areas of the country, and that the country was tipping back in the other direction.
But bottom line is you're satisfied with leaving a stable regime, not necessarily a democratic regime.
I think right now in Afghanistan, what we should be focused on is a regime that is stable, that is pro-Western, and that would not reconstitute a threat to the country.
Okay,
To the country being the United States.
President George W. Bush said a great deal. Most of the intelligence we got about Al Qaeda was from people we captured in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and other places and brought back to Guantanamo for the most part, or eventually sent in some cases to countries where in fact they were interrogated by the CIA. But a major question in the first couple of years of the Obama administration is whether we treat captured terrorists like domestic criminals or like unlawful enemy combatants. If you were president, where do you come down on that question?
Unlawful enemy combatants.
Do they need to come to the United States to prison?
No.
Do they need to be given a civilian trial?
No.
Can we try them in a military commission?
Absolutely.
Can we execute them if a military commission finds them guilty?
Yes.
All right, now the another major question, which President Obama has changed the policy. George W. Bush is unrepentant in his book for waterboarding Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Zubaydah. There's only 3 al-Qaeda terrorists that were ever waterboarded. If you were president of the United States and you captured a terrorist, al-Qaeda or other kind of terrorist, who you believed might have intelligence that could protect the United States from an attack, would you repeat what George Bush did and waterboard?
I would
that
be
person?
open to considering it.
You'd be open to considering it?
I'd have to look at the facts and circumstances of the situation and make a judgment. But I think that's something that should be on the table.
You wouldn't categorically rule out
I
the
would not
possibility.
categorically rule it out, nor would I say that I would use it. But I would
Is
say-
that predicated on your belief that waterboarding doesn't in fact impose serious harm on the person who's waterboarded?
It's predicated on the belief that we should use restraint in questioning to the extent possible, but to the, when the situation dictates, if I believe that it imposed serious harm, it was quote torture, then I wouldn't use it.
All right.
So obviously I'm leaving the door open to use it because I don't believe it's torture.
President Bush said there were a couple of techniques that he did not allow. He said that doctors had said there would be no serious or permanent psychological or physical harm to the people who were waterboarded, and that in fact did not meet the legal definition of torture. According to all those factors being considered, you agree with those factors?
I would agree with that. That was my analysis, and I said it at the time.
And under that analysis, if you would be open, if necessary, to using that technique.
Right, but look, I understand it's a very, it's a tough tactic. And to the extent that we can get information short of that, I would prefer to use those tactics.
Another very controversial thing that President Bush did was authorize warrantless wiretaps of electronic communications came from overseas into the United States
right.
For intelligence gathering purposes.
And I supported that.
And some people would argue that this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. This is an unreasonable search and seizure to intercept an international communication coming in the United States.
People in the international world are not given that privilege under the Constitution.
You believe this is also an act of war. It's not something that's governed, that someone having an international communication with a terrorist.
If we have reason to suspect that the person calling from internationally is a terrorist, or someone who is here is being contacted as a terrorist, then we have an obligation to intercept.
For national security reasons.
Absolutely.
All right. On September 11th, 2001, when you were serving on the Armed Services Committee of the United States, we had 19 hijackers hijacked 4 planes. 2 of them went into the World Trade Towers. 1 of them went into the Pentagon. 3rd was crashed in your home state of Pennsylvania. Those 19 hijackers were all young men. They came from 3 countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The oldest was only 33 years old. They all were given visas freely to come into the United States of America, some to stay for extended periods. Many of them had student visas. Some overstayed their visas. Since 9/11, we have continued to give long-term visas for young men to come from these countries and other countries where Al-Qaeda recruits terrorists. Is that a wise policy?
I think, look, and this gets to a broader issue of, what we need to be looking for with respect to making sure our country is secure. In the media today, the term profiling is seen as somehow a pejorative term. I think it's used every day in police work in this country. It's used every day in lots of areas of analyzing the information you have before us, and making a determination who is the most likely person, whether it's a business person who's most likely to buy your hamburgers, or is it someone who's most likely to commit a crime, or someone who's most likely to commit an act of terrorism? And you have to do that analysis, and you have to have a much more rigorous system in place to make sure that those people have less access to cause harm than everybody else.
So you would use what you would perceive as the profile of a potential terrorist to subject someone to stricter scrutiny for a visa.
I would use common sense that 94-year-old Swedish grandmothers are probably not someone who needs extra care in the visa process or in the immigration process, but a 19-year-old from Yemen, who spent 2 years in Afghanistan, probably should be looked at more seriously.
At this point, historically, is there any need for the United States to give a student visa, say, to a 19-year-old young man from Yemen?
I guess it would depend on the particular skills and of that 19-year-old, but probably not. I mean, if he is a concert cellist, maybe. But if we're talking about just allowing a 19-year-old Yemeni man into this country, I think that we should be much more cautious about allowing folks like that into the country.
Because you wouldn't roll it up at stricter scrutiny.
I would, much stricter scrutiny.
Okay, let's talk about immigration generally for a moment. The DHS uses a metric it calls border miles under effective control to measure how well they are securing the U.S.-Mexico border. And in October, they told our reporter Edwin Mora that their current analysis says of the 1,949-mile Mexican border, they have 873 miles under effective control, which, by the way, according to their definition, means in those 873 miles, they have a reasonable chance of actually going out and intercepting someone they've detected who's crossing the border. If you were president, what would you do to make sure that whole 1,949 miles of border was secured?
Well, I mean, it's not unreasonable to deploy the resources necessary, and I'm not an expert on how you secure a border. I mean, you have physical barriers, you have human intelligence, you have technological surveillance, you have technological borders. There's all sorts of things that you can do to create some stability at the border, and we should deploy whatever's reasonable, depending on the terrain and lots of other things that would create more effective control of this of the whole, 1,900 miles of border.
But are you confident that the United States has the assets and the technological know-how to actually secure the U.S.-Mexico border?
Of course,
it can be done.
Of course,
It's not being. Why is it not being done now?
It's a matter of resources and will.
It's a matter of
will,
right?
Which, of course, is. There aren't enough resources to make that happen.
How essential is it that the next president show the will to actually secure the U.S. Mexico
Look, I think
border?
that's a piece of the immigration puzzle. But to me, we need to look at border security. We need to look at obviously employment, but we also have to look at the fact that look, I'm the son of an immigrant, and I believe in immigration. I think for a lot of reasons. We want to bring people into this country who want to be Americans, who want to work here, who want to raise their families here, who want to buy into the American dream. And I look at the immigration numbers. Yes, we bring a lot of people into this country. I'm actually open to bringing more. Why? Well, because legally. Because unfortunately we abort a third of our children in this country.
Right.
And the population of this country, but for immigration, would be declining.
Right.
So there's a reason to bring people into this country, but we need to bring into these people in this country who want to be Americans. And that's very important, which means they will learn English. They will participate, as every immigrant group has, in assimilating into the culture. Those are very, very important things, and that means even more from Mexico. Fine, even more from Mexico if they want to come here and be part of the American experience.
But Senator, just to clarify something, if you were president, you would deploy the resources necessary to secure the Mexico border, whether it's walls, fences, manpower. You would do it.
I would deploy the resources to secure the border.
Okay, according to the Pew Hispanic Center, they estimate there's about 12 million illegal aliens in the United States right now. Would you
I think
provide...
well, that's curious because I thought that number was down fairly substantially. And they maybe at one time was 12, but I've heard a lot lower numbers recently.
The Pew Hispanic Center put out a report, I think, in September 2010. It was numbers as of 2009. It could go down,
yeah.
but roughly 12 million.
Okay.
Would you, under any circumstances, give amnesty to those 12
No, I wouldn't give amnesty, but as I said before, I think we need to secure the border, but I also need to look at how we create a system, because I think we do need more people coming into this country who want to be productive citizens in America and to grow this economy. I mean, you want to fix the Social Security problem? Let's have more workers who are here and producing and helping out the situation. So, I'm not. I think this is really important. I'm not against people coming into this country who want to come here because, like previous generations, it's in their DNA to be free. It's in their DNA to buy into the American dream.
Sure, but if you're a person in El Salvador or in the Philippines or in Italy who wants to immigrate to the United States, you have to wait in line behind people who've already come here illegally.
Well, that's the whole point. Is I'm willing to, if you want to open up the spigot a little bit more,
right?
And that includes even from Mexico. And then when you do that, then you create an opportunity for folks to go back to Mexico and not have to wait 10 years to come back to this country. Maybe wait a relatively short period of time and come in the right way and come in so they can stay and they can prosper and they can thrive here.
You say go back and come back in a relatively short time?
Yeah, it depends. I don't know how long a period of time it would be, but for me, the key is that I'm willing to allow increased immigration in this country, which could hopefully create a path for people to come into this country the right way, instead of, having come to the country the wrong way.
All right, you mentioned that this could help solve our Social Security problem. The fact of the matter is, right now, according to the Social Security Administration and the Government Accountability Office that has looked at this issue a lot, there are a great many illegal aliens in the United States who are using someone else's Social Security number. They're using a fraudulent Social Security number. They pay huge amounts of payroll taxes for Social Security Medicare, which they are not qualified to receive.
Right. And they don't receive.
At the same time, they're fraudulently using a Social Security number. And the Social Security Administration actually puts together a list of employers who, they call them no-match W-2s, submit 100 or more no-match W-2s. If you're a president, what would you do about these corporations in America, some of which are filing thousands and thousands of no-match W-2s every year, indicating that they're hiring significant numbers of illegal aliens?
Yeah, at least from what I understand, according to the Obama administration, prosecutions under that statute have gone up in recent times. Now, that's one of the claims that they've made. I can't independently verify that, but that's what they've said. They said they've actually gotten tougher on enforcement of those who are chronic abusers of that problem. And if that's the case, I commend them for doing that. And if they're not doing that, they should be doing it.
The IRS has argued and told the Social Security Administration and the GAO that the W-2s that come back and that do not match, and they go into this special file the Social Security Administration maintains, cannot be used for immigration enforcement because it's tax information. Do you believe that the government should be able to, DHS should be able to use no-match W-2s? In other words, if an employer sends thousands a year of W-2s where the name does not match the Social Security number, that the government ought to be able to use that to enforce the immigration laws?
I think the government ought to be able to use it to find out why they're not matching. And if they're not matching because they're illegal immigrants, then they should have the ability to find that out, yeah.
Okay. What do you see as the greatest external threat facing the United States in the next decade?
External threat.
Yes.
I still believe that it's radical Islam, and more through through its network of support within the array of countries out there that see themselves as the successors to America, as the dominant, whether it's in their region or in the world. People like Russia and China and Venezuela and Korea and others who would like to see America knocked off the top rung, and would like to see other countries have more sway. I'm sure the Chinese and the Russians may have dreams, or in my opinion delusions of controlling the world as the Americans have for the last several decades. I think most of them just want America off their beat. I think most of them just want to be able to to not have to be able to run their neighborhood, if you will, and whether it's Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua and Central and South America, or whether it's China and Korea and the Asia Pacific, or whether it's Russia and Europe and South Central Asia. I think that's where they're headed, and Islam is a very powerful, huge potential to work with these folks, these unaligned groups, if you will, that could cause disruptions. And in my opinion, this president has done nothing but encourage them by trying to negotiate with them, pander to them, while turning our back systematically on our allies who want to confront them and protect the West and protect America. And we're not investing the resources. We're not standing up diplomatically. And as a result, I think that movement continues. I call it the gathering storm of the 21st century. I think that movement continues to grow, and if not checked, will pose a serious threat to the future of our country.
Are you going to run for president in 2012?
I'm seriously considering it. I think I bring something different to the table than certainly than this president, but than many of the others, or maybe all of the others who are at least talking about running for president. And I think that voice should be heard out there. And I'm going out there and seeing whether people agree with that.
When will you decide?
In the next few months. I mean, one of the things I've noticed is no one's really champing at the bit right now to jump into the race. And so I sort of see this as a time to do a little better analysis as to how viable this effort would be, and again, the resonance that my voice has out there. So we'll continue to analyze that. I'm moving forward. I'm hiring people. I'm trying to raise some money, and ricksantorum.com. If anybody would like to send some money our way to try to help energize this effort, and we'll sort of take it a step at a time and see how it goes.
Senator, thank you very much.
Thanks, Terry.